Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Harvard Law Forum, the longest-running American law school speaker series. I am Pete Davis, a 3L here at the law school, and the chair of the Harvard Law Forum. I am so excited about our guest today because I've tried during my time at the helm of the forum to not just invite wise elders, but also to invite wise young folks too, who are going to be the movers and shakers of the 21st century. It's why I brought Tim Faust, who is going to win Medicare for all for our country. It's why I brought Nathan Schneider and Jason Weiner, who are going to convert our corporate economy into a cooperative economy. It's why I brought Matt Stoller, who's going to bust our century's trust. It's why I brought Elizabeth and Matt Brunig, who are going to help shape the moral agenda of our generation. And it's why I brought Heather McGhee, who's going to be president in the not-so-distant future. As the suffragist Lavinia Dock said in 1917, "The young are at the gates." Today we are joined by another insightful and inspiring young gate crasher, Briahna Joy Gray. Briahna is a leading millennial writer on identity politics, racial justice, and economic power. She has been featured in New York Magazine, Rolling Stone, and The Guardian. She is the host of the SWOTI podcast. SWOTI. It stands for Someone's Wrong on the Internet, and it's a podcast from two people of color who enjoy discussing politics, relationships, and pop culture. And she is a contributing editor to the greatest magazine in the world, Current Affairs, which we have copies of right here, and we have two other editors, Briahna and Oren. And by the way, she is a lawyer. A rare Harvard Law Forum lawyer, and a graduate of this fair institution. She is here to share her views on identity politics, racial and economic justice, and paths forward for the left in the Trump era. Let's hear it for Briahna Joy Gray.
Thank you, Pete. That was quite the introduction. At first, when he said he doesn't want to invite any wise elders, but young people, I just knew he was going to leave wise off of that. And I was going to say that's correct, because this all feels like such a lot for me. This is so new. I just started writing about this topic, or writing at all, frankly, about a year ago, last summer. And identity politics is, in fact, the subject that compelled me to start writing, largely because as someone who has an identity that's invested with a lot of power currently as both a black person and a woman, but whose political beliefs don't necessarily always line up with what people expect my identity to dictate. I found time and time again, and we'll talk about this as I go through my slides, that I was on the outs with respect to what my identity was supposed to dictate. So specifically, what I mean is that as a Sanders supporter in 2016, through the present, to be honest, I constantly found myself up against people on the internet who would say, "You're not right. Your opinion isn't correct. Bernie Sanders isn't good for black people. You shouldn't be voting for him. You wouldn't understand why, because you're privileged, because you don't have the requisite perspective to understand." And when I would identify myself as actually a person of color and a woman, the BernieBro stereotype would collapse, and you would find people not knowing what to do with themselves at all. And the level of dissonance there was really remarkable, and it led me to write my first article in Current Affairs, which tackled this idea of identity politics and how it is particularly being weaponized to advance certain political agendas. The identity politics controversy really started in earnest with an article by Mike Lilla, which a lot of you are probably familiar with. And that article was unfortunate, I believe, because it teed up the conversation in a way that isn't necessarily always fair to both sides. So there's this idea that's pretty pervasive that the people who are kind of generally supportive of identity politics are good liberals, progressive people, kind of our kind of people, and that the people who are not big fans of identity politics disagree with it, aren't fans, because they basically don't agree with the notion of identity at all. So you get a lot of people who bristle when you make any critique of identity politics on the basis that people who critique identity politics are bigoted, they're racist, they don't particularly want to acknowledge the reality or relevance of individual identity. They resent the fact that white identity is losing cultural status in today's world. And they also ignore the fact that all politics is identity politics. So what is considered to be mainstream politics is in fact a variety of simply white identity politics. And so we saw this kind of characterization of identity politics critiques in Ta-Nehisi Coates's piece, The First White President, in The Atlantic, where he picks up on Lilith's criticism and says all politics are identity politics except the politics of white people, the politics of the bloody heirloom. Sometimes those people are right. Certainly, people like Mark Lilla, in the course of his article, sometimes call out the fact of identity as a problem in and of itself. So he has this one passage where he talks about the idea of transgender Egyptians somehow distracting from broader, bigger, more important political questions, as though there's not something to be learned or any insights to be gained, or that the experiences of transgender Egyptian people don't relate at all to larger political questions. And I think this is the kind of thing that is very frustrating to people on the left when critiques of identity politics arise. It's people who seem to be critiquing the fact of identity itself as opposed to how identity is being used in any particular political context. And the flaw there, and what's so frustrating, is several-fold. One thing is that it ignores the fact that identity doesn't just spring up naturally. As a black woman, I didn't wake up one day and decide, you know what, I want to set myself apart and different. I think I'm going to come up with this thing called blackness, and this is how I'm going to walk through the world. In fact, especially as a black American, I was born into a country which has a legal system for categorizing my identity, and there were very specific legal consequences for being a black person. And as a result, there's no surprise that one's political identity would develop to be protective of that identity, to enable people to form coalitions around those identities. And so there's something that's particularly frustrating to be told, why do you focus on identity all the time? Why is this such a big deal for you? Why are you being so divisive? Which is the kind of narratives we get a lot from the right? When in fact we all know that we are largely forced by the dominant identities in America to identify the way that we do. And the fact that we coalition build around it is largely defensive and self-protective. But sometimes people who critique the critics of identity politics are also off base. There are people who assume that these, the kind of criticisms that I just described, are the only kinds of criticisms that exist. So in a fairly good article that I liked in The New Yorker, Adam Gopnik describes identity politics critics in this way. He says that identity politics seem simply to be interest group politics pursued by groups with whom you don't happen to identify. Gay and transgender people are now emancipated to bring their interests to bear, and they do, as the Irish and Jews did before them. So the idea that, people who don't like the identity politics are just mad because the identities that now have social value and that people can agitate around just don't have value to the people who care. They just don't have value to mainstream white Americans, to men, and that's why they're so dismissive of the politics altogether. So I think what we can see then is that a lot of the controversy has to do with the fact that people have differing definitions of what identity politics are and what the word actually means. So if we reference our good friend Wikipedia, we can see that identity politics there is defined as a tendency for people of a particular religion, race, social background, etc., to form exclusive political alliances, moving away from traditional broad-based party politics. That seems pretty uncontroversial. Adam Gopnik goes on and in his article defines it as the idea that politicians should consider, cater to is the usual phrase, identifiable or self-identified groups. I think his definition is interesting because it does have this implication that politicians are responding to identities in a way that is not necessarily always in good faith. I think whenever people use the word cater to, it's one step, skip, and a hop away from pandering to. And there's this idea that identities don't really matter. People aren't actually aiming to lend direct services or actually give direct benefit to identity groups, but that they just have to virtue signal something about identity. Let's say reference having hot sauce in their bag or an affinity for Beyonce as a way to signal, oh, I appreciate your identity, I recognize you, and I see you in a way that doesn't exactly necessarily yield substantive political results. So in my article, I understood exactly that these kind of fissions existed. And I wanted to be very clear that when I went on to make my critique of identity politics, that people didn't think I was actually critiquing the fact of identity, and that I understood the value of identity, not just personally, but politically. So I was very conscious to open my article with a defense of what I think is the value of identity politics. And I said that having identity politics is incredibly beneficial. Identity politics, which emphasizes the unique concerns of different communities and demographic groups, shows how historical inequities have been distributed across different races, genders, religions, abilities, and sexualities. In doing so, it allows us to better understand how to critique and reform the systems that replicate those inequities. It revealed how the foreclosure crisis, for instance, disproportionately hurt Black homeowners, how health issues manifest differently across populations, and how various forms of hidden taxes penalize women in professional life. So that's one of the things that people get particularly defensive about, right? The fact that as a political policy measure, without tracking identity, it's hard to track the ways in which people's marginalized identities, the fact that identities have come under attack, have actually manifested in policy outcomes that are disparate. And that if you were to say, let's ignore identity, as some of these identity critics have, if you were to say identity simply doesn't matter, then you would lose part of your ability to understand how people are being harmed contemporaneously by certain kinds of biases that obviously persist. So identity matters. I want to be very clear on that before I go into my own critique. But it can cause some problems too. So what we've seen a lot in contemporary political moment is that identity is being used not as a proxy for one's political beliefs, but as a complete substitute for their political perspective. So 2016, not to relitigate the election, but for what it's worth, was a really good example of how these things played out. And I think part of why 2016 was so contentious is because there were these gulfs between people's personal identities and what they were supposed to stand for and people's actual politics. So one of the best examples of this was the BernieBro Phenomenon. Now, I believe it was a Vanity Fair writer who coined the term, has subsequently written and said that he regrets doing so because he didn't think it was going to be quite as viral and pervasive as it was, and he was actually someone who was sympathetic in part to the progressive message. But what happened was there was this belief that because Bernie Sanders supporters were predominantly white, which is debatable, but even assuming that's the case, there was this subsequent logical leap that said, therefore, the man's ideas must be pro-white and, in fact, antithetical to the needs and interests of people of color. And some people took that even farther to imply pretty strongly that the man himself was racist, and anything that was said or done by his supporters was directly attributed to him consciously in a way that wasn't necessarily done with other politicians. So lest you think that I'm exaggerating or being defensive about this, evidence is forthcoming in the form of tweet grabs. But one of the most frustrating arguments that I saw among a lot of my peers from this law school, intelligent people whom I respect a lot, was that after the early primary votes in southern states, we got a lot of people saying things like, the majority of Black voters did not support Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary. Therefore, as the northern states are rolling around, northern primaries are rolling around, if you support Bernie', you are, quote, disenfranchising Black voters. Now, you probably understand what the word disenfranchise actually means, and it doesn't mean voting in a contrary fashion to somebody that you disagree with. But as a black voter who planned to vote for Bernie Sanders when the New York primary came around, it was very disorienting to be told that basically my people had spoken, and that therefore my own political beliefs, which were rooted in what I understood the candidate's underlying values to be and their underlying political agenda to be, were invalidated not because of anything that he had actually said or done, but because the voter pool that had voted prior to my own primary coming up had spoken for me, and their identity dictated something about that candidate's value. So I just grabbed a little screen grab there of a tweet that showed somebody making the argument in the course of a chain that that Hillary was a better candidate, not for substantive reasons, which obviously could be argued, but because she got overwhelmingly the votes of POC. What she didn't get, this person notes, is white women and uneducated white men, and the implication being that anyone who does get white women and uneducated white men is, as a candidate, inferior. So what we saw was, while people were making arguments, Ryan Cooper of The Week was one of these, a white man who was making arguments that were critiquing some of the not just 2016 candidates, but some of the 2020 hopefuls as 2017 came around and people immediately started looking to see how we were going to get out of this, was that critiques of people like Kamala Harris and Cory Booker were criticized as being racist. So what you saw was people on the left saying, well, we have Black Lives Matter now. We're very concerned about issues relating to police violence. Maybe we shouldn't have a former prosecutor who has a record in which she has been very aggressive and proud of her record of incarceration, leading the charge of the liberal agenda. You had people critiquing Hillary Clinton's choice of Tim Kaine as VP, saying things like, okay, well, if we want the best candidate for women, what do we think about this guy who supports the Hyde Amendment, which would forbid federal funding for abortion services? And what do we feel about his record for governor, in which he voted for a number of pro-life types of interventions, including getting parental permission to get abortions and things like that. But those critiques didn't land very well. What you saw was that critiques of even Tim Kaine by proxy of Hillary Clinton were called sexist. And critiques of Kamala Harris's criminal justice record were described as racist and or sexist. So what you got was this idea of this way in which identity became a substitute for people's underlying political beliefs in their entirety. Another phenomenon you got was the idea that whiteness itself became the focus of critique, as opposed to the power that often accrues with whiteness. So we all understand that we live in a world where race has been used as an instrument of power, right? So there's a certain overlap of interest between people who have the most wealth, money, and power in this world, and who are also white. And that has caused us to do things like conflate what we're actually upset about with a person's identity. So frequently you get people who say things like, Bernie Sanders is straight white male privilege in an ill-fitting suit. I'm not clear what the substantive critique is there, right? So there's a critique that could be made saying, if you were to say, Bernie Sanders' perspective in life doesn't allow him to understand this issue, and here's the evidence of it. You know, because he's a senator from Vermont, he has shown tone deafness when talking about these specific minority issues. But the fact of being straight or white or male does not in and of itself say anything about somebody's beliefs or values. And while I understand that we live in a world where we have to make generalizations, we're hit with a lot of information every day, and we all do it to some degree, there's a certain critical leap that is being made, or rather a critical oversight, more accurately, that is being made that's causing people to conflate whiteness and power. And I don't have a problem with that because I'm out here trying to play the world's tiniest violin for white men who are falsely accused of having too much power. But what the problem is I don't want people to forget what we're actually objecting to. Because the world is changing. And there's going to come a time where the person in power, the person who's problematic, the person that is trying to curb the liberties of more vulnerable people around them is not necessarily going to be white. And we're going to have to do a radical change in our language when that time comes around if we don't start identifying better what it is that we're actually objecting to. I also think this is presents a real risk in America, in a country where increasingly there are people who are, shall we say, happy to stigmatize identity politics and the way that we talk about race and say that we're the ones that are being intolerant and that we're being racist against whites, and that therefore, why not have an organization that's pro-white, hypothetically? What's wrong with standing up for pro-white identity interests? What's wrong with going down to Home Depot and getting a few tiki torches, lighting them up and walking around, shouting about how white identity matters as well? And so, this is a tricky point because I don't mean to say that to lay the blame at the feet of obviously marginalized groups for the kind of backlash that we've seen in terms of the alt-right and some of the racism that we saw in Charlottesville last summer. But I do think that the way that we talk about race is oftentimes imprecise in a way that makes it easy to parody and easy to frame as though it is objections to it are legitimate, right? So I just don't. My personal view is that I think the left could do a lot of good work to make sure that we're not using language that is easy fodder for people who would use our own identity framing against us and to the detriment of people who are actually, in fact, marginalized. And an example on the right, you see someone who's accusing someone of being a white man, as in the course of the argument below, the incorrect record person, and then the response is, "Oh, I'm not a normal white man. My father came to America in a cargo ship through a newly opened Ellis Island." I thought that was a pretty typical story of a normal white man myself. But there's this funny phenomenon that happens where people start to try to distance themselves from whiteness because they understand the cultural capital that comes now from not being white. Here's some fun examples. Some of you might be familiar with Peter Daut, one of my favorite sparring partners on the internet. He's the inventor of the Verit verification website. It wasn't never really that clear to me what its objectives were. It didn't last very long. But one thing that he's famous for doing on the internet is leveraging his wife's identity as a woman of color to defend himself in arguments. So what you see on the left is I just went to his Twitter and typed in woman of color and wife and got but that's not an exhaustive list, but this is a bunch of the times that he's defended himself saying, my wife is a woman of color, white males, blah, blah, blah. Here's, millions of women, particularly women of color, like my wife, at my wife's hashtag, were insulted, yada, yada, yada. This guy is insulting and disrespecting my wife at her hashtag, a woman of color, and on and on and on. One thing I think that's particularly interesting about the Peter Daut example is that his wife is a brown-skinned South Asian woman. He never says specifically that she's South Asian, but from her picture, it's not clear because it's a small thumbnail. It's not clear what her race is. And this is just my suspicion. I can't prove it. But it seems to me that he is also aware of how much more traction you get from, in this kind of weaponized identity world, from being black as opposed to other kinds of people of color. And my personal suspicion is that he specifically characterizes her just as a woman of color with the hopes that people fill in that she's black and therefore his defense is more powerful than it would be if she were a South Asian woman, because these things now matter. There's this hierarchy of identity that started to develop. Now, the apotheosis of Peter Daut came on the right, where about a month ago, instead of weaponizing his wife, which a lot of people have called him out on, and which she participates in, she's a free agent here in this, he decided to do a poll asking, well, what if I'm actually a person of color? Now, Peter Daut is, I believe, half Lebanese American. And I am completely supportive of him identifying as a person of color. What I am not supportive of is the fact that he has, to this point, identified as white, perceived himself as white, moved through the world as a white man, has at no time felt the need to defend himself on the grounds of his own identity. But now that there's a certain amount of political capital in identifying as such, he threw up a Twitter poll and asked his followers, hey, am I a person of color now? The voting results don't matter because it's facially ridiculous. Okay, so this was another example. I've blacked out this woman's name because when this talk was originally scheduled for last month, this tweet thread, this little screen grab on the left had gone viral. And earlier in that week, and I had tweeted to my followers, hey, remember that person who did that funny thing, identity politics things earlier this week? Can somebody find and grab that for me? I can't figure out who it was or what it was said. She saw that and got very frustrated with me and was very upset that I was going to expose her to the thousands of people who are coming to this talk as opposed to the millions of people who are going to see this on the internet. So I went ahead and blocked it out. But what developed from that exchange was that well, first let me tell you what the exchange was about. So this was a back and forth. It's not really important. I think Liz Brunnen was involved. This was a response to something that she had posted. And the subject was something unrelated to race. And so this woman at the top said, where did I say anything about taxes, blah, blah, blah. And someone hops in and says, I'm not white. So I think that this person had criticized her saying, it's only white people who support these kinds of policies that are more centrist, let's say. So I was actually, I'm critical of the leftists here as well who unnecessarily injected race into this conversation. This person then says, I'm not white. Don't make that criticism, I'm not white. The person she was arguing with then went into her Twitter thread and put in the word white and searched for it and found these 4 different instances in which she says, I'm white, I'm white, I'm white, I'm ... white. Now, people love this. People who are very online, very on here, like myself, we eat this kind of thing up, right? This is exactly what we're upset about because people know that they live in a world in which they can get a certain amount of traction from identifying a certain way. Therefore, they get into this place where when their back up is against the wall, suddenly someone who identifies as one race will flip and identify as another race, not because of any persecution or real life experiences they've actually had, but simply because it's politically advantageous in a moment. So again, I don't care how this person identifies. She is also Lebanese. Power to her. My Arab American friends, we tend to identify them as people of color. It makes it easier for when we're sitting around talking crap about what's going on in the world. But my issue here is how she's leveraging her identity for political reasons. We all know who Peter Daut is. I'll breeze through some of these a little bit faster. I got a little overzealous when I started collecting these from my file of people who've been wrong on the internet. Here's where it gets really juicy because these people are directly, explicitly saying that their identity matters more than their substantive politics. So Gotham Girl Boo, she's a black woman who has tweeted, if this uptick in representation and voices doesn't excite you because it won't promote your ideology sucks. So if you're not into this diverse array of candidates because they don't actually represent your ideological beliefs, it must be a problem of your ideological beliefs because it couldn't possibly be that these people of color are wrong. Okay. That seems to me to be a ginormous step backward from what we want. I had the privilege of going down to see Senator Sanders speak in Jackson, Mississippi in an event that made some headlines last week. And he spoke with Jackson, Mississippi's mayor, Chokwe Lumumba. And at the end of Chokwe Lumumba's remarks, a black millennial progressive mayor, he noted that there was a time when we were looking for politicians that looked like us. And now it's time to find politicians who think like us. Unfortunately, that mentality is not increasingly uncommon in this world. So we saw the brouhaha also with Cynthia Nixon, who announced that she was running for governor of New York. Christine Quinn, another New York political figure, responded to her saying now she wants to be an unqualified lesbian to the governor of, she wants an unqualified lesbian to be the governor of New York. Christine Quinn is also lesbian. So it was interesting that she picked up on Cynthia Nixon's sexual identity as a point of criticism. The subtext of this exchange seemed to be, there can only be one lesbian, and it's going to be me. You know, and now Cynthia Nixon has this on all her buttons and stuff because it was a great, absurd screen grab. But you have this idea, again, of identity being the key relevant factor in any person's political persona. Very popular internet figure, Imani Gandhi, says that Wall Street, to care about Wall Street is a white thing. It's the whitest shit she's ever heard. And she defends herself more on the right, saying, sorry, but Wall Street at the top of my concerns, you're welcome to disagree. And I see this a lot. And this is one of the things that I find to be most hurtful, is that in a world in which 40% of Black people lost 40% of the collective wealth in the fallout of the recession, 40%. There is a narrative that a lot of people not very consciously buy into. I don't want to blame individuals necessarily, but that things that aren't explicitly racialized, policies, political agendas that aren't specifically targeted or addressed to people of color shouldn't matter to people of color, despite the fact that a lot of these more general issues like healthcare, free college education, minimum wage, disproportionately affect people of color. So you have people out here, she's got something like 50, 70,000 Twitter followers proselytizing the belief that Wall Street is a white thing. I'll skip by some of these. And here's some examples of when people's belief that race matters most butts up against the fact of my identity. So one of my favorites, yes, I'm a white dude in a basement. I'm pretending to be a person of color. Feel free to go home and tell your friends that you saw me in the flesh and that I appear to be what I've represented myself to be. And my favorite, when someone was confronted with some YouTube clips from our podcast, was told that I must have been raised by white people if I were Black, that my political identity couldn't just come from, having a political identity. This one was fun. She told me to go and make a Black friend to learn what my Blackness is. That's always cool. Okay. We'll skip this one too. But what you see a lot is this dialogue about erasure as well, like where people, again, Peter Dow, threatening that for me to disagree with a woman, in this case, Hillary Clinton, is for me to erase her. So there's this kind of identity bullying that starts to happen, where I guess my status as a woman and a person of color is beneath hers, because to have a political disagreement, to simply have differing views on a subject, is to have this battle of who's erasing whom, whose voice is being elevated, whose voice is being knocked off the pedestal, as though we're all not just equal participants in a Twitter flame war that nobody is going to know about unless they decide to make a slideshow and subject a bunch of Harvard Law students to it. Okay. So what we've seen is identity can be used as both a weapon and as a shield. In this instance, there was a lot of criticism following Barack Obama's choice to take $400,000 in speaking fees to a bank. A lot of people thought that when you are paid to a lot of money by a certain group, that you might not be able to be an advocate when your advocacy is in conflict with the interests of that group. This is a fairly common political phenomenon that happens. We understand the negative influence of money in politics. However, a lot of people defended him on the basis that other presidents before him, obviously they've all been white, have taken advantage of this opportunity, and why would you withhold that opportunity from a Black man? Why would you deny the first Black president the same equal advantages? And of course, if you did critique him, that was considered to be racist as well. More examples of that. We get it. Here is a podcast that I previously really enjoyed quite a bit, Call Your Girlfriend. Aminatou Sow is one of the hosts of that podcast, who was doing this as well, adopting the Somali pirate meme to say, look at me, I am the black person here. And in the same way that Christine Quinn did with Cynthia Nixon, I am the person. There can only be one. There is one identity and one voice that goes along with that identity. Joyanne Reed's another one of my favorites, dabbling in this on the internet, MSNBC host, commentator. She was scrapping it up with this white guy who's I've screen grabbed on the right. I couldn't actually put his tweet because she blocked him right after she responded to him. But she told him she's going to be out here fighting for marginalized people while you wax superior from your penthouse. Joyanne Reed's not doing too badly, so I've heard, as an MSNBC commentator, also a graduate of this law school. And the white guy replied, best part, she blocked me right after she tweeted it. I didn't get to tell her about my basement apartment and crushing student loan debt. Same. So again, you see this identity as a substitute for class politics as well. Joyanne Reed must be have less privilege in any context, in any environment, than any white man, regardless of economics. Class has no relevance in any of these debates. Okay, we can skip through some of those. I'm being indulgent. So these are just a few quick good ones. Of course, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, why would anybody be criticizing these people? It must be not because they take money from pharmaceutical companies and or fail to prosecute people who had were participants in the financial crisis and responsible for the loss of a lot of people's money and wealth. It has to be because they both are black. It wasn't the emails, it was the she-mails. We saw a lot of this, yada, 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 yada. Okay, so identity politics can be both a shield and a sword. We've seen these examples before. So what I want to really clarify then is the problem isn't so much with identity politics itself, it's with the way that identity politics is being manipulated. It's being used as a way to advance certain political ideologies. And that's why it's so important now. We are at a time when progressivism is on the rise. And a lot of people are being exposed to ideas for the first time, perhaps, and are really feeling them. We are in an America where the majority of us now support universal health care, for instance. But we have these countervailing narratives that say things like health care is for white people. Healthcare isn't, if you really cared about communities of color, you would be focused on issues that weren't exclusively aimed at general universal policies, for instance, which completely ignores the fact that Latinos, for example, are 3 times more likely to be uninsured than white Americans. Black Americans are twice as likely to be uninsured as white Americans. And of course, the benefits of these kinds of programs will accrue disproportionately to those groups. But instead you get free college is racist. This was an argument that came up in 2016, I think, by John Conyers, who said it was going to hurt HBCUs if public colleges were available for black students to go to, historically black colleges and universities. So the idea there is it's better, let's kind of coerce, make sure that black students have to go to HBCUs and not have an opportunity to go to college for free, despite the fact that, here's a fun fact, black students actually apply and get into colleges at higher levels than any other group. But we matriculate at lower levels because largely we have difficulty paying for college. So you get a black representative making an argument that free college is racist that seems to be aimed at advancing certain political goals while ignoring the fact that free college would disproportionately accrue to the benefit of the community that he's supposed to serve. Free healthcare is a pony. Have Bernie's expensive jacket, brouhaha. He's a man of privilege. He's white. He doesn't care about the issues of the people. These become the focus of the conversation. And it also causes us to make make choices in terms of political strategy that are likely to be ineffective. So you saw a lot of talk among Democrats in 2016 that presupposed that being able to get the vote of diverse people, of black and brown people, was going to be enough to win. And there's a way in which black and brown voters, particularly brown voters, because there is, black people do very cohesively vote Democrat in very large numbers. There's a way in which people ignore the fact that that same voting bloc doesn't exist among Latino voters. So when you ignore things like that, when you ignore the diversity of views among a very diverse population, you miss the fact that, for example, Trump won more blacks and Latinos than Mitt Romney did. And when you of course, race was a huge and significant factor in the last election, but when you narrow the entire conversation down to what identity, how identity was acting and motivating voters, as opposed to looking at how identity and class were used in tandem to draw on people's anxieties and fears, then you start to miss a huge part of the equation. And so why this largely matters is because it's a part of this that's been teed up, this controversy that's been teed up as the be-all, end-all controversy of the moment, which is, should we pursue class or should we pursue race? Of course, this is a false choice. But the way in which identity is spoken about today suggests to people that it's kind of hollowed ground. Because we are, at least people who are progressive, people who are liberal, are very sensitive to the historical harms that various groups have suffered, the idea that those interests would be marginalized, particularly after people fought so hard to get political notice for those issues, right? It took a long time for people to even have the political floor to advocate on the behalf of their identities. The idea that those would be then marginalized to have a conversation about class, it strikes people as bad, and they're very sensitive about it. And I understand that, and I want to be sympathetic to that. But the problem here is that, as a result, people have put these two things in opposition, when in fact they have to be dealt with simultaneously. Because in the same way that breaking up the banks won't cure racism, curing racism isn't going to end predatory lending practices, because that's just not how it works. Not to mention that I don't know what anybody's policy plan is for how they are going to cure racism in 2020. Okay, so these are some more examples of people saying the fact of people's racism means that they couldn't possibly, there couldn't possibly be any economic reasons that also motivated votes for Trump, as though these things couldn't be working in tandem. So again, this is problematic because, one, these two things are inextricable. You can't talk about one without talking about both. Being able to talk about class effectively is incredibly beneficial to be able to make the kinds of coalitions, form the kind of voting coalitions that you need to actually win elections, as opposed to just being vaguely virtuous on the internet. And also, a certain kind of talking about identity enables politicians to get away with very superficial gestures toward identity that don't actually result in a substantive effort to uplift the groups that they purport to be uplifting. So you get this hot sauce in your bag style identity politicking, or even worse, people who would defeat programs that are grossly beneficial to people of color because they aren't advanced by a member of your party, for instance, with the healthcare for free public education example. And the kind of political strategy angle of this is what I talk about in my identity politics article for New York Magazine, where in this clip, I'm opining about the ways in which Obama's identity as a black man enabled him not to have to hit all the racial notes as hard as another politician might have to, like someone like Bernie Sanders might have to, while campaigning on a very FDR-style Great Society platform that today is getting characterized as white when it's coming out of the mouths of at least Senator Sanders. So I want to skip I think some of these and just talk just for a moment at the end because I was able to have this very interesting experience of traveling with Senator Sanders last week to Mississippi. And I don't know if you guys are aware of the press that came out of that event. But the event itself was a very powerful discussion about economic justice put on by the capital city of the poorest state of the Union. And I was really struck by how powerful that message was resonating in that room, and how it was a message that was organic to that room, not something that was brought there by Bernie Sanders, but was something that the people were invested in, and that they had, which was reflected by the fact that they had elected this mayor who self-describes socialist, millennial, young black mayor. And here in this poorest state in the union, with a Republican legislature that is getting, does not get the federal funds it needs to support its community, you had people who really understood that when Martin Luther King, who we were there to celebrate, to memorialize, when he talked about, justice isn't flinging a coin to a beggar. It's recognizing that an edifice that creates beggars needs to be changed. That quote hung above that talk, and it really infused every part of the conversation that night. And I went to bed feeling really heartened, because I had spoken to Senator Sanders about how he's received by the black community, and what he could do to try to improve how he was perceived. And he seemed to not see it as quite as big as a problem as I saw it as. And by the end of the night, I thought, you know what, he's right. Because he's down here with these people, and I'm seeing how the people are responding, and the people get it. The people love this. There's no problems at all. So I go to bed, I wake up, I prepare for my flight, I'm jotting down ideas about what I'm going to write this story about. And then I see that the press coming out of this event is all about the fact that at one point in his remarks, Bernie Sanders criticized the Democratic Party for its, quote, failures, including the fact that it's lost 1,000 legislative seats over the past 10 years, a nearly unprecedented number, and noted the fact that Obama was such a charismatic and brilliant man that perhaps the fact that he was president, distracted people and covered for the fact that the party itself was doing so poorly. This remark, according to the media the next day, was the height of racism. And there was no coverage over the beautiful event in the South. There was no coverage about the fact that these ideas, socialism, democratic socialism, progressive values, were very organically coming out of this 85% black city with their charismatic and brilliant black mayor. It was all about the ways in which Bernie Sanders isn't good at identity. And that, I think, is the real tragedy here. And why I am concerned continually with this issue of identity politics. Because identity politics is great when it's doing what it's supposed to do, when it is uplifting the needs of specific marginalized people, when it's shining light on the ways in which disparities persist. But it's not great when it's doing the exact opposite, when it's being used to condemn social programs, condemn a political agenda that is particularly geared to offering more substantive change than any that has been offered in recent history. But that because the mouthpiece of that movement may or may not conform to a particular identity, that makes that person vulnerable and that entire movement at risk. Just to wrap up, there were some examples of people with marginalized identities who've made a lot of political headway. And I think this is something absolutely to celebrate and be proud of, in a way that people like Mark Lilla, identity politics critics like him, don't agree with. But I wanted to bring this example up because Danica Rowan herself says that she didn't win because she's a trans woman. When asked, she always points back to the fact that I ran on traffic issues. I ran on what I knew was most important to the people in my community. And that I just want to also be clear that we shouldn't just conflate the celebration of the fact that we live in a world where someone like Danica isn't forbidden as a matter of who she is from running, that she had actually a chance and that she succeeded. That means a lot about how far we've come, and that is absolutely something to celebrate. But the fact of her identity isn't what made her a great candidate, and the people who voted for her understood that. And that's a lesson that we need to take into 2018 into 2020, is that identity alone is not enough. Identity is a wonderful thing, it's something to be celebrated, but it is not a substitute for substantive political beliefs and ideologies, and that first should come the politics, and what should then follow then is identity or the person. So thank you. I want to leave time for questions. I haven't left very much.
Questions, but then, so maybe like 1 or 2 questions if we can keep it. You know?
Sure.
And then you'll be outside to talk to people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Afterwards.
Sure. Sure.
I guess I want your perspective on this idea that, you know, like leftist politics are white now, when there's like actually a pretty long history of black socialism, and you know, specifically the Black Panther Party, Frank Hampton, specifically they, you know, were talking about building broad coalitions of people of color and white people in Appalachia and throughout the entire Midwest. So where do you think this like message has gotten lost? And you know, why is it that today it's like clearly identified as like white to care about names?
So I have a cynical answer and a slightly less cynical answer. The less cynical answer is that I think that black people, and I understand this about myself as well, we are at times rightfully defensive about the way that history has been told. So there is this way in which racism has constantly, there's been an effort to erase it from the second things happen. I mean, 10 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, folks were talking about, why are you still complaining about this? You're free now, let it go. There was no one's racist anymore, right? And so there has been a pushback then to talk about all the parts in our history on our end that actually were racist. So you know, we talk about unions now. There's an emphasis on the fact that there was a lot of racism among union organizers, and that prevented black people from gaining the full access to the benefits that unionizing created. But what that has then done, in a weird topsy-turvy sort of way, is associate, in some people's minds, unions bad racist. Instead of looking at the fact that, while of course the unions have disproportionately accrued benefits to white people, they were also some of the made some of the biggest inroads into job equality in the South. Same with FDR Great Society programs. Yes, the New Deal disproportionately accrued to white people. It also hugely benefited people of color. So it's a bit of a logical leap that's preventing people from understanding that you can both be critical of the ways in which universal programs have not always been so universal in the past, but also understand that that's not an argument to try to tear down or to thwart those programs, but to try to remedy them. My less cynical answer, after particularly going down to Mississippi last week, is that everybody, the black people on the ground get it. Black people approve of Bernie Sanders more than white people do. Something like 73% of black people approve versus 50-something% of white people. But the media, the corporate media, feels differently about it. And the vision of what I saw on the ground and how people in the South are responding to Senator Sanders, and the message that gets picked up online by a lot of like black pundits in particular, and the white pundits who then weaponize their point of view, that's a different matter. Yeah. Yes.
Do you ever have this conversation with black conservatives at all?
That's an interesting question. My co-host of SWOTI Pod, Joe here in the back, we had an episode where we specifically did want to talk to people of color who are conservative and white rural liberals, right? So it's the last episode of our last season, episode 25. We talked to a black Republican, like a young Bangladeshi Republican/centrist, and a white rural guy from Kentucky. And, you know, it's always a little bit frustrating to talk to Republicans, but we thought that by talking to people of color, I'm sorry. I mean, look, I want to have these conversations. That's why we had this guy on the show. And we thought that by having someone who's a person of color, we could use the fact that we had a similar starting point to try to get around some of the gaps that sometimes exist in these conversations. I want to know why you asked that question.
Because I guess I know a lot of like super black people that don't want to have this conversation in this direction around like politics versus identity and like what comes first, right?
Yeah.
And so are also mistrustful of this approach in this, you know what I mean? Because you get an
Yeah, well,
to a certain
yeah.
extent, right?
It's a zero-sum game to people. It's either or.
Right, it's really, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Sorry.
And so I'm just kind of like thinking about like your position within that, because super like black people like don't trust this, and definitely don't trust black conservatives too. And so that's why I was just like thinking about that.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a very clear answer for you, but I do think that it's important to keep having these conversations no matter how frustrating they are, and it's something that we hope to do on SWOTI Pod. So I know we're wrapping up, but feel free to take a card to learn more about SWOTI Podcast and these free current affair magazines so you can learn more about these kinds of topics that we write about frequently. And thank you very much for coming.
Let's hear